Good afternoon. Welcome to Quarantine Storytime. Hey, I'm Charlotte, and thank you guys for joining me here today. Sorry, I'm running a few minutes late. Normally, I'm try to have this up by 3 o'clock, or at least be going live by 3. Um, but here we are, and we are testing a new mic today. So, if there's sound quality issues, do let me know. Hopefully, there is sound coming through. Otherwise, this will be an exercise in futility. Today we are reading Volume 4, Part 3, Sections 10 through 19 of War and Peace. And that actually takes us to the end of Part 3 for this, the end of Part 3 in Volume 4. So we're really getting close to the end. Thank you guys for sticking with me through this. It's been really exciting and interesting and enlightening to read it and aloud with you for the first time, and just to read it, like I said, for the first time at all. So I hope it's been interesting for you as well. As we're getting near to the end, I'm asking anyone to submit any ideas for follow-up books to read, because it's kind of been fun doing this journey together online with you. So if you have any ideas, let me know. Also, like I said, we're testing microphones. So there was one on Friday that we used again on Monday and made some modifications to. And then there was a different one yesterday and a different one today. So if you have any votes, Friday, Tuesday, Wednesday, let me know. Yeah, I hope everyone is doing well, staying safe, and a lot of craziness out there. So hopefully staying safe and hopefully just doing the best you can to spread love and betterment, I think is the word I want to use. As you guys will recall from yesterday's reading, Petya has joined up with Dolokhov and Denisov, two of our other favorite characters in the Russian army. And Denisov and Dolokhov are kind of doing guerrilla warfare and attacking small parts of convoys of French troops as they leave Moscow and indeed seem to be retreating almost out of Russia, and sort of attacking small convoys and stealing that sort of booty from them, that sort of thing, killing or capturing soldiers. Petya has met up with them because he was an adjutant to a general, and he has gone off with Dolokhov on this reconnaissance mission for their next attack. So we will see they're planning on attacking this convoy train the next morning. We will just see if that happens and how it works out, and hopefully all these characters make it out safe. So let's not have too much further ado. Let's jump right in. And I'm going to go ahead and put this over here. Been reading sort of sideways, and that just seems to work out very well. There we go. So, Section 10. On returning to the guardhouse, Petya found Denisov in the front hall. Alarmed, anxious, and vexed with himself for having let Petya go, Denisov was waiting for him. "Thank God," he cried. "Well, thank God," he repeated, listening to Petya's rapturous story. "Devil take you, I haven't slept because of you," said Denisov. "Well, thank God, now go to bed. We can still get some sleep before morning." "Yes. No," said Petya. "I don't want to sleep yet, and I know myself. If I fall asleep, that's the end, and then I usually don't sleep before a battle." Petya sat for a while in the cottage, joyfully recalling the details of his ride and vividly imagining how tomorrow would be. Then, noticing that Denisov had fallen asleep, he got up and went outside. Outside it was still quite dark. The rain had stopped long ago, but drops were still falling from the trees. Close to the guardhouse, he could see the black outlines of the Cossacks' lean-tos and the horses tethered there. Behind the cottage, the two wagons showed black, with horses standing by them, and the dying fire glowed in the ravine. Not all the Cossacks and hussars were asleep. Here and there, among the sound of falling drops and the closer sound of horses munching, he could hear soft, as if whispering, voices. Petya stepped out of the front hall, looked around in the darkness, and went over to the wagons. Someone was snoring under the wagons, and around them stood saddled horses munching oats. In the darkness, Petya made out his horse, whom he called Karabakh, though it was a little Russian horse, and went over to it. Well, Karabakh, tomorrow we'll do some service, he said, sniffing its nostrils and kissing it. What, master, you're not asleep? Said a Cossack who was sitting under a wagon. No, but your name is Likachev, isn't it? I've just come back. We took a ride to the French. And Petya told the Cossack in detail, not only about his ride, but also why he had gone and why he thought it better to risk his life than to act any old way. Why don't you get some sleep? Said the Cossack. No, I'm used to it, Petya replied. Maybe the flints in your pistols are worn out. I brought some with me. Don't you need some? Take them. The Cossack stuck himself out from under the wagon to have a closer look at Petya. Because I like to do everything neatly, said Petya. Some do things just like that, anyhow, without preparing, and then they're sorry. I don't like that. Right you are, said the Cossack. And another thing, please sharpen my saber, dear heart. It's gotten blunt, but Petya was afraid to lie. It's never been sharpened. Can it be done? Why not? Likachev stood up, rummaged in the packs, and Petya soon heard the martial sound of steel against a whetstone. He clambered onto the wagon and sat on its edge. The Cossack under the wagon was sharpening the saber. And what, are the lads asleep? Asked Petya. Some are, and some are like us. Well, and what about the boy? Visenny? He's there in the front hall, just dropped off. Fright makes you sleep. He was so glad. After that, Petya was silent for a long time, listening to the sounds. Footsteps came from the darkness, and a black figure appeared. What are you sharpening? Asked the man, coming up to the wagon. A saber for the master here. That's a good thing, said the man, whom Petya took for a hussar. Did I leave my bowl here? There, by the wagon. The hussar took the bowl. Likely it'll be light soon, he said, yawning, and went off somewhere. Petya ought to have known that he was in the forest in Denisov's party, a mile from the road, that he was sitting on a wagon captured from the French with horses tethered by it, that under him sat the Cossack Likachev, sharpening his saber, that the big black spot to the right was the guardhouse, and that the bright red spot down to the left was the dying campfire, that the man who had come for the bowl was a hussar who wanted a drink. But he knew nothing of that and did not want to know. He was in a magic kingdom, in which there was nothing resembling reality. Maybe the big black spot was indeed the guardhouse, but maybe it was a cave that led into the very depths of the earth. Maybe the red spot was a fire, but maybe it was the eye of a huge monster. Maybe he is indeed sitting on a wagon now, but it very well may be that he is sitting not on a wagon, but on a terribly tall tower, from which, if you fell, it would take you a whole day, a whole month to reach the earth, and you would just keep falling and never get there. Maybe it was simply the Cossack Likachev sitting under the wagon, but it very well may be that he is the kindest, bravest, most wonderful, most excellent man in the world whom nobody knows. Maybe it was indeed a hussar who came for water and went back into the hollow, but maybe he just vanished from sight, vanished completely, and never was. Whatever Petya might have seen now, nothing would have astonished him. He was in a magic kingdom in which everything was possible. He looked at the sky. The sky was as magical as the earth. The sky was clearing, and clouds raced over the treetops as if uncovering the stars. Sometimes it seemed that the clouds dispersed and a black, clear sky appeared. Sometimes it seemed that these bright patches were clouds. Sometimes it seemed that the sky rose high, high above his head. Sometimes the sky came right down so that he could touch it with his hand. Petya began to close his eyes and rock. Drops dripped. Quiet talk went on. Horses neighed and scuffled. Somebody snored. Ozhik zik, Ozhik zik, whispered the saber being sharpened. And suddenly Petya heard a harmonious chorus of music playing some unknown, solemnly sweet hymn. Petya was musical, like Natasha, and more so than Nikolai, but he had never studied music or thought about music, and therefore the melodies that unexpectedly came to his head were especially new and attractive to him. The music played more and more audibly. The melody grew, passing from one instrument to another. What is known as a fugue was going on, though Petya had not the slightest idea of what a fugue was. Each instrument, now resembling a violin, now trumpets, but better and clearer than violins and trumpets. Each instrument played its own part, and before finishing its motif merged with another, started out almost the same, and with a third, and with a fourth, they all merged into one and scattered again, merged again, now solemnly and churchly, now brightly brilliant and victorious. Ah, yes, it's me dreaming, Petya said to himself, rocking forward. It's in my ears, and maybe it's my music. Well again, go on, my music, now. He closed his eyes, and on all sides, as if from far away, the sounds trembled, began to harmonize, and scattered, merged, and again all joined in the same sweet and solemn hymn. Oh, how lovely this is! As much as I like, and however I like, Petya said to himself. He attempted to conduct this large chorus of instruments. Softer, softer now, fade away, and the sounds obeyed him. Fuller now, merrier, more joyful. And the swelling, solemn sounds rose from an unknown depth. Now voices join in, Petya ordered. And voices, first men's, then women's, came from far away. The voices grew in a measured, solemn effort. Petya felt frightened and joyful, hearkening to their uncommon beauty. The song merged with the solemn, victorious march, and the drops dripped, and the bzik, zik, zik, whispered the saber, and again the horses scuffled and neighed, not disrupting the chorus, but entering into it. Petya did not know how long it went on. He enjoyed it, was surprised all the while at his enjoyment, and sorry that there was no one there to share it. He was awakened by Likachev's gentle voice. It's ready, Your Honor. You'll split a Frenchman right in two. Petya woke up. It's getting light already. It's really getting light, he cried. The formerly invisible horses could now be seen down to their tails, and watery light was coming through the bared branches. Petya shook himself, jumped up, took a ruble from his pocket, and gave it to Likachev, swung the saber to try it out, and put it in the scabbard. The Cossacks were untying the horses and tightening their saddle girths. And here comes the commander, said Likachev. Denisov came out of the guardhouse and, calling Petya, told him to get ready. Section 11. In the half-darkness, horses were quickly taken, girths were tightened, and units were formed. Denisov stood by the guardhouse giving last-minute orders. The infantry of the party, splashing with 100 feet, went ahead on the road and quickly disappeared among the trees in the pre-dawn mist. The Esau was giving some orders to the Cossacks. Petya was holding his horse by the bridle, waiting impatiently for the order to mount up. Washed with cold water, especially his face, especially his eyes, burned with a fire, a chill ran down his spine, and something trembled rapidly and regularly all over his body. Well, is everything ready? Said Denisov. Bring the horses. The horses were brought. Denisov got angry with the Cossack for the slack girth, and having rebuked him, mounted up. Petya took hold of the stirrup. The horse, out of habit, went to nip him in the leg, but Petya, not feeling his own weight, quickly leapt into the saddle, and looking back at the hussars who set out behind him in the darkness, rode up to Denisov. Vasily Fedorovitch, will you entrust me with something? Please, for God's sake, he said. Denisov seemed to have forgotten about Petya's existence. He looked at him. One thing I ask of you, he said sternly. Listen to me and don't poke your nose anywhere. During the whole traverse, Denisov did not say a word more to Petya and rode silently. When they rode up to the edge of the forest, it was beginning to grow noticeably light in the field. Denisov said something in a whisper to the Esau, and the Cossacks began to ride past Petya and Denisov. When they had all ridden past, Denisov touched up his horse and rode down the hill. Sitting back and sliding, the horses and the riders descended into the hollow. Petya rode beside Denisov. The trembling in his whole body kept increasing. It was growing brighter and brighter, only the mist hid distant objects. Having ridden down and looked around, Denisov nodded to a Cossack who was standing next to him. The signal, he said. The Cossack raised his hand, a shot rang out, and at the same moment came the thud of horses galloping ahead, shouts from different sides, and more shouts, and more shots. At the same moment, as the sound of thudding hooves and shouts rang out, Petya, lashing his horse and loosening the reins, not listening to Denisov, who was shouting to him, galloped forward. It seemed to Petya that it suddenly became completely bright, like midday, just as the shot rang out. He rode up to the bridge. Ahead of him, Cossacks were galloping along the road. On the bridge, he ran into a Cossack who lagged behind and galloped on. Ahead of him, some people, it must have been the French, were running from the right side of the road to the left. One fell into the mud under the feet of Petya's horse. By one cottage, Cossacks were crowded, doing something. A terrible cry came from the midst of the crowd. Petya rode up to this crowd, and the first thing he saw was the pale face of a Frenchman with a trembling lower jaw, who clutched the shaft of a pike pointed at him. Hurrah, lads! Ours! Cried Petya, and giving free rein to his excited horse, he rode on up the street. Shooting was heard ahead. Cossacks, hussars, and ragged Russian prisoners were running along both sides of the street, shouting something loudly and incoherently. A dashing Frenchman in a blue greatcoat, hatless, with a red, frowning face, was fighting off some hussars with his bayonet. When Petya galloped up, the Frenchman had already fallen. Late again, flashed into Petya's head, and he rode to where he heard the sounds of rapid gunfire. The shots were coming from the courtyard of the manor house, where he had been the night before with Dolokhov. The French had ensconced themselves there behind the wattle fence in a garden densely overgrown with bushes, and and were firing at the Cossacks crowded in the gateway. Riding up to the gate, Petya saw Dólokhov amidst the powder smoke and a pale greenish face, shouting something to the men. "Go around! Wait for the infantry!" he was shouting just as Petya rode up to him. "Wait! Hurrah!" shouted Petya, and not losing a moment, he galloped towards the place from which the shots were coming and where the powder smoke was thickest. A volley of shots rang out. Stray bullets whined and splattered into something. The Cossacks and Dólokhov galloped after Petya through the gates of the house. In the dense, undulating smoke, some of the French dropped their weapons and ran out of the bushes towards the Cossacks. Others ran down the hill to the pond. Petya galloped on his horse across the manor courtyard, and instead of holding the reins, waved both arms somehow strangely and quickly, and kept slipping further and further to one side in his saddle. Running into the campfire smoldering in the morning light, the horse balked, and Petya fell heavily onto the wet ground. The Cossacks saw how his arms and legs jerked rapidly, though his head did not move. His head had been pierced by a bullet. Having parleyed with the senior French officer, who came out to him from behind the house with a handkerchief on his sword and announced that they would surrender, Dólokhov got off his horse and went over to Petya, who lay motionless with outstretched arms. "Finished," he said, frowning. Walked out of the gates to meet Denisov, who was riding towards him. "Killed?" cried Denisov, seeing from afar off the familiar, undoubtedly lifeless position in which Petya's body lay. "Finished," Dólokhov repeated, as if uttering this word gave him pleasure, and walked quickly to the prisoners surrounded by dismounted Cossacks. "We won't take any," he cried to Denisov. Denisov did not reply. He rode up to Petya, got off his horse, and with trembling hands turned Petya's face towards him. It was stained with blood and mud and already turning pale. I'm used to something sweet. Excellent raisins, take them all," he recalled. And the Cossacks glanced around in surprise at the sounds, similar to a dog's barking, with which Denisov quickly turned away, went to the wattle fence and caught hold of it. Among the Russian prisoners retaken by Denisov and Dólokhov was Pierre Bezukhov. I was wondering if he would be there. Poor Petya. Section 12. During the whole time of its movement from Moscow, there had been no new instructions from the French authorities about the party of prisoners that Pierre was in. On the 22nd of October, that party was no longer with the same troops and trains with which it had left Moscow. Half of the train with biscuits, which had followed them during the first marches, had been taken by the Cossacks. The other half had gone further ahead. Not one of the dismounted cavalrymen who had marched before them was left. They had all disappeared. The artillery, which during the first marches could be seen ahead, had now been replaced by the huge train of Marshal Junot, escorted by Westphalians. Behind the prisoners came the train of cavalry supplies. From Vyazma, the French troops, formerly moving in 3 columns, now went in a single crowd. The signs of disorder which Pierre noticed on the first halt after Moscow had now reached the final degree. The road they followed was strewn on both sides with dead horses. The ragged men who fell behind various units changed constantly, now rejoining, then again falling behind the moving column. Several times during the march there were false alarms, and the soldiers of the convoy raised their muskets, fired, and ran headlong, trampling each other, but then gathered again and denounced each other for needless fear. These 3 assemblies moved together: the cavalry depot, the depot of prisoners, and Junot's train, still constituted separate entities, though the first, second, and the third were quickly melting away. In the first depot, in which there had been 120 wagons to begin with, there now remained no more than 60. The rest had been captured or abandoned. Of Junot's train, several wagons had also been abandoned or captured. 3 wagons had been looted in a raid by straggling soldiers from Davout's corps. From the conversation of the Germans, Pierre heard that more guards had been placed on the train than on the prisoners, and that one of their comrades, a German soldier, had been shot on orders from the marshal himself because a silver spoon belonging to the marshal had been found among the soldiers' possessions. Of these 3 assemblies, the depot of prisoners had melted away most of all. Of the 330 men who had set out from Moscow, there now remained less than 100. The prisoners were a still greater burden to the soldiers of the convoy than the saddles of the cavalry depot or Junot's train. They understood that the saddles and Junot's spoons might be of some use, but why the hungry and cold soldiers had to stand guard and watch over equally cold and hungry Russians, who were dying and fell behind on the road, who were ordered to be shot, This was not only incomprehensible but also repugnant, and the convoy, as if fearing, in the grievous position they found themselves, to give way to the pity they felt for the prisoners, and thereby worsen their own position, treated them especially grimly and sternly. In Dora Gobuz, while the convoy soldiers, having locked the prisoners in a stable, had gone to loot their own storehouses, several of the imprisoned soldiers tunneled under the wall and escaped, but they were caught by the French and shot. The former order, introduced at the departure of Moscow that the captive officers would go separately from the soldiers, had long since been abolished. All those who could walk went together, and since the third march, Pierre had been reunited with Karatev and the bow-legged purplish dog, who had chosen Karatev for its master. Karatev, on the third day after leaving Moscow, came down with that fever in which he had been lying in the Moscow hospital, and as he grew weaker, Pierre withdrew from him. Pierre did not know why, but ever since Karatev had begun to weaken, he had to make an effort to approach him, and approaching him and listening to the quiet moaning with which Karatev usually lay down during their halts, and sensing the increasing smell that Karatev now gave off, Pierre moved further away from him and did not think about him. In captivity, in the shed, Pierre had learned, not with his mind, but with his whole being, his life, that man is created for happiness, that happiness is within him in the satisfying of natural human needs, and that all happiness comes not from lack, but from superfluity. But now, in these last 3 weeks of the march, he learned a new and more comforting truth. He had learned that there is nothing frightening in the world. He had learned that, as there is no situation in the world in which a man can be happy and perfectly free, so there is no situation in which he can be perfectly unhappy and unfree. He had learned that there is a limit to suffering and a limit to freedom, and that those limits are very close. That the man who suffers because one leaf is askew in his bed of roses suffers as much as he has now suffered falling asleep on the bare, damp ground, one side getting cold as the other warmed up. That when he used to put on his tight ballroom shoes, he suffered just as much as now when he walked quite barefoot. His shoes had long since worn out, and his feet were covered with sores. He learned that when, by his own will, as it had seemed to him, he married his wife, he had been no more free than now, when he was locked in a stable for the night. Of all that he, too, later called suffering, but which at the time he hardly felt, the main thing was his bare feet, covered with sores and scabs. Horse meat was tasty and nutritious. The saltpeter bouquet of the gunpowder they used instead of salt was even agreeable. There were no great cold spells, and walking in the daytime always made him hot, while at night there were campfires. The lice that ate him warmed his body pleasantly. One thing was painful at first, his feet. On the second day of the march, when Pierre examined his sores by the campfire, he thought it would be impossible to step on them. But when everybody got up, he went along limping, and then, having warmed up, walked without pain, though by evening his feet were still more frightful to look at. But he did not look at them and thought of other things. Only now did Pierre understand the full force of human vitality and the saving power of the shifting of attention that had been put in man, similar to the safety valve in steam engines, which releases the extra steam as soon as the pressure exceeds a certain norm. He did not see or hear how the prisoners who fell behind were shot, though more than 100 of them had already died in that way. He did not think about Karatev, who grew weaker every day and obviously would soon be subjected to the same lot. Still less did Pierre think about himself. The harder his situation became, the more terrible the future, the more independent of the situation he found himself in were the joyful and calming thoughts, memories, and images that came to him. Section 13. At noon on the 22nd, Pierre was going up a hill on a muddy, slippery road, looking at his feet and the unevenness of the way. Now and then he glanced at the familiar crowd around him, and then again at his feet. Both were equally his own and familiar to him. The bow-legged purplish gray ran merrily along the side of the road, cocking its hind leg and hopping on 3 to prove its agility and satisfaction, then dashing along again on all 4, barking at the crows that sat on the carrion. Gray was sleeker and merrier than in Moscow. On all sides lay the flesh of various animals, from men to horses, in various states of decay. The walking men kept the wolves from coming near, so that Gray could eat as much as he liked. It had been raining all morning, and seemed as if it were just about to stop, and the sky to clear, when after a short pause the rain would come down still harder. The rain-soaked road no longer absorbed water, and streams flowed down the ruts. Pierre walked along looking on all sides, counting his step by 3s, and bending his fingers. Addressing the rain, he would inwardly say to it, "Well, well, go on, give us some more." It seemed to him that he was not thinking of anything, but somewhere far and deep in his soul was thinking something important and comforting. That something was the subtlest spiritual extract from his conversation the day before with Karatev. The day before, at their nightly halt, having grown cold by a dead campfire, Pierre had gotten up and gone over to the nearest better burning fire. By the fire he went to sat Platon, his great overcoat covering his head like a priest's vestment, and telling the soldiers in his quick, pleasant, but weak, sickly voice a story Pierre knew. It was already past midnight. This was the time when Karatev usually recovered from his bouts of fever and was especially animated. Coming up to the fire and hearing Platon's weak, sickly voice and seeing his pitiful face brightly lit by the fire, Pierre felt something stab his heart unpleasantly. He was afraid of his pity for this man and wanted to go away, but there was no other fire, and so, trying not to look at Platon, Pierre sat down by the fire. "So how's your health?" he asked. "My health? Lament for your sickness, and God won't grant you death," said Karatev, and he went back at once to the story he had begun. "And so, brother mine," Platon continued, with a smile on his thin, pale face, and with a special joyful brightness in his eyes, "and so, brother mine." Pierre had long known this story. Karatev had told it to him alone some 6 times, and always with a special joyful feeling. But however well Pierre knew the story, he now listened to it as something new, and the quiet rapture that Karatev clearly felt as he told it communicated itself to Pierre. It was a story about an old merchant who lived a seemly and God-fearing life with his family, and went once with a comrade, a rich merchant, to the Macquarie. Having stopped at an inn, the 2 merchants went to bed. The next day, the comrade was found murdered and robbed. The bloody knife was found under the old merchant's pillow. The merchant was tried, punished with the knout, and having had his nostrils slit, was, in due order, as Karatev said, sent to hard labor. And so, brother mine, Pierre arrived at this point in Karatev's story. 10 years or more go by after this affair. The old man lives at hard labor, duly submits, does nothing bad, only asks God for death. Good. And the convicts got together, a nightly thing, like you and me here, and the old man was with them. They started talking about who suffers for what, and what he's guilty of before God. They began telling, this one killed a man, that one killed 2, another set a fire, another was a runaway, so he did nothing. They started asking the old man, "What are you suffering for, Grandpa?" "I, my dear brothers," he says, "am suffering for my own and other people's sins. I didn't kill anybody or take anything that wasn't mine, but even gave to beggars. I, my dear brother, was a merchant. I had great wealth. Thus and so," he says. That is, he told them how the whole thing went in proper order. "I don't grieve over myself," he says. "God, that is, has found me. I only pity my old wife and children." And so the old man wept. In their company there happened to be the very man who had killed the merchant. "Where did it happen, Grandpa?" he said. "When? In what month?" He asked everything. His heart ached inside him. He got up to the old man and plopped at his feet. "You're perishing because of me, old man. It's the real truth. This man is suffering, lads," he said, "guiltlessly and needlessly. I did that deed," he said, "and put the knife under your head while you slept. Forgive me, Grandpa," he said, "for Christ's sake." Karatev fell silent, smiling joyfully, gazing at the fire, and he adjusted the logs. And the old man says, "God will forgive you, and we're all sinful before God. I'm suffering for my own sins." And he wept bitter tears. And what do you think, little falcon? Karatev was speaking with a rapturous smile that beamed brighter and brighter, as if what he was about to tell contained the chief delight and the whole meaning of the story. "What do you think, little falcon? This same murderer denounced himself to the authorities. 'I killed 6 men,' he says. He was a great villain. 'But I'm sorriest for this old man. Let him not lament on account of me.' He declared it. They wrote it down, duly sent a letter. This was a far-off place. It was a while before anything was done, and all the papers filled out as they ought, to the authorities, that is. It went all the way to the Tsar. Time passed, the Tsar's ukase came. Release the merchant, give him a reward, as much as they decided. The paper came, they started searching for the old man. 'Where's that old man who suffered guiltlessly and needlessly? A paper has come from the Tsar.' They started searching." Karatev's lower jaw quivered. But God had already forgiven him. He was dead. "There it is, little falcon," Karatev concluded, and for a long time, smiling silently, he looked straight in front of him. It was not the story itself, but its mysterious meaning, the rapturous joy that shone in Karatev's face as he told it. the mysterious significance of that joy that now strangely and joyfully filled Pierre's soul. Section 14. "À vous places!" a voice suddenly cried. Among the prisoners and the convoy, a joyful commotion and expectation of something happy and solemn set in. Shouts of command were heard on all sides, and the cavalrymen appeared to the left, well dressed, on good horses, trotting around the prisoners. On all the faces there was the expression of tension that people have at the proximity of high powers. The prisoners pressed together, and they were pushed off the road. The convoy formed up. L'Empereur, l'Empereur, le Marshal, le Duc, and the well-fed convoy had no sooner passed than a carriage rumbled by, drawn by gray horses in tandem. Pierre caught a glimpse of the calm, handsome, fat, and white face of a man in a three-quartered hat. It was one of the marshals. The marshal's gaze turned to the large and conspicuous figure of Pierre, and in the expression with which this marshal frowned and turned away, Pierre fancied he saw compassion and the desire to conceal it. The general who led the depot, his face red and frightened, urging on his skinny horse, galloped after the carriage. Several officers came together, with soldiers surrounding them. They all had tensely excited faces. "Qu'est-ce qu'il a dit? Qu'est-ce qu'il a dit?" "What did they say? What did he say?" Pierre heard. As the marshal was driving by, the prisoners pressed together, and Pierre saw Karatev, whom he had not yet seen that morning. Karatev, in his meager greatcoat, still leaning against a birch tree. In his face, besides the expression of yesterday's joyful tenderness as he was telling the story of the merchant's guiltless suffering, there also shone an expression of quiet solemnity. Karatev looked at Pierre with his kind, round eyes, now veiled with tears, and was evidently calling him over, wanting to say something, but Pierre was too afraid for himself. He pretended that he had not seen his look, and hurriedly walked away. When the prisoners started off again, Pierre looked back. Karatev was sitting at the edge of the road by the birch, and two Frenchmen were saying something over him. Pierre did not look any longer. He went limping up the hill. From behind where Karatev had been sitting came the sound of a shot. Pierre heard the shot clearly, but the moment he heard it, he recalled that he had not finished the calculation, begun before the marshal passed, of how many marches there remained to Smolensk, and he started to count. Two French soldiers, one of them holding a smoking gun in his hand, ran past Pierre. Both were pale, and the expression of their faces, one of them glanced timidly at Pierre, had something in it similar to what he had seen in the young soldier at the execution. Pierre looked at the soldier and remembered how, 2 days before, this soldier had burned his shirt while drying it over the campfire, and how everybody had laughed at him. A dog began to howl behind, in the place where Karatev had been sitting. "What a fool! What's it howling about?" thought Pierre. Like him, his soldier comrades, walking beside Pierre, did not turn to look at the place from which the shot had been heard, and then the howling of the dog, but there was a stern look on all of their faces. Section 15. The depot and the prisoners and the marshal's train stopped in the village of Shemshevo. They all crowded in a mass by the campfires. Pierre went up to the fire, ate some roasted horse meat, lay down with his back to the fire, and fell asleep at once. He slept again the same sleep he had slept in Mozhaisk after the Battle of Borodino. Again the events of reality combined with dreams, and again someone, he himself or some other person, spoke thoughts to him, and even the same thoughts that had been spoken to him in Mozhaisk. Life is everything. Life is God. Everything shifts and moves, and this movement is God. And while there is life, there is delight in the self-awareness of the divinity. To love life is to love God. The hardest and most blissful thing is to love this life in one's suffering, in the guiltlessness of suffering. Karatev, Pierre recalled, and suddenly a long-forgotten meek old teacher who had taught him geography in Switzerland emerged in Pierre's mind as if alive. "Wait," said the old man, and he showed Pierre a globe. This globe was a living, watery, wavering ball of no dimensions. The entire surface of the ball consisted of drops tightly packed together, and these drops all moved and shifted, and now merged from several into one, and now divided from one into many. Each drop strove to spread and take up the most space, but the others, striving to do the same, pressed it and sometimes destroyed, and sometimes merged with it. "This is life," said the old teacher. "How simple and clear it is," thought Pierre. "How could I have not known it before?" In the center is God, and each drop strives to expand in order to reflect him in the greatest measure. It grows, merges, and shrinks, and is obliterated on the surface, and goes into the depths, and floats up again. "Here he is, Karatev. See, he spread and vanished." "Vous avez compris, mon enfant?" said the teacher. "Vous avez compris, sacré nom," shouted the voice, and Pierre woke up. He raised himself and sat up. A Frenchman was squatting by the fire, having just shoved a Russian soldier aside, and was roasting some meat on a ramrod. His sleeves were rolled up, and his sinewy, hairy, stub-fingered red hands were deftly turning the ramrod. His brown, gloomy face with frowning eyebrows was clearly visible in the light of the coals. Que lui est bien égal, he growled, glancing quickly at the soldier who was standing behind him. Brigand, va! And turning the ramrod, he glanced gloomily at Pierre. Pierre turned away, peering into the shadows. One captive Russian soldier, the one whom the Frenchman had shoved aside, was sitting by the fire and patting something with his hand. Looking more closely, Pierre recognized the purplish dog, who was sitting by the soldier, wagging its tail. Ah, it's come, said Pierre. Ah, plais. He began and did not finish. In his imagination, suddenly, simultaneously connecting among themselves, memories merged of the gaze with which Platon had looked at him, sitting under the tree, of the shot he had heard from that spot, of the howling of a dog, of the criminal faces of the two Frenchmen who had run past him, of the smoking gun in the hand, and of the absence of Karatev at this halt, and he was ready to then to understand that Karatev had been killed. But at the same moment a memory merged in his soul, coming from God knows where, of an evening he had spent with a beautiful Polish woman in the summer on the balcony of his house in Kiev. And still, not connecting the memories of that day and not drawing any conclusions about them, Pierre closed his eyes, and the picture of the summer nature mixed with the memory of bathing, of the liquid, wavering ball, and he sank somewhere into the water, so that the water closed over his head. Before sunrise, he was awakened by loud, rapid gunshots, and shouting French soldiers ran past him. Les Cossacks! One of them shouted, and a moment later Pierre was surrounded by a crowd of Russian faces. For a long time Pierre could not understand what was happening to him. On all sides he heard his comrades' shouts of joy. Brothers, my dear ones, my darlings, the old soldiers cried out, weeping, embracing the Cossacks and the hussars. The hussars and the Cossacks surrounded the prisoners and hastened to offer them, one clothes, another boots, another bread. Pierre sobbed, sitting among them, and could not utter a word. He embraced the first soldier who came up to him and kissed him, weeping. Dólokhov stood by the gates of the ruined house, letting a crowd of disarmed soldiers go past him. The French, shaken by all that had happened, talking loudly among themselves, but as they went past Dólokhov, who tapped himself lightly on the boot with a whip and looked at them with his cold, glassy gaze, which promised nothing good, the talk ceased. Opposite him stood Dólokhov's Cossack, counting the prisoners and marking the hundreds with a chalk line on the gate. How many? Dólokhov asked the Cossack who was counting the captives. Going on the second 100, replied the Cossack. Filets, Dólokhov kept repeating, having learned this expression from the French, and meeting the eyes of the passing soldiers, his gaze flashed with a cruel gleam. Denisov, with a gloomy face, taking off his papka, followed behind some Cossacks who were carrying to a pit dug in the garden the body of Petya Rostov. Section 16. From the 28th of October, when the frost set in, the flight of the French only acquired a more tragic character of men freezing or roasting to death by campfires, and of the emperors, kings, and dukes in fur coats continuing to drive on in carriages filled with stolen goods. But in essence, the process of flight and decomposition of the French army had not changed in the least since the departure from Moscow. Between Moscow and Vyazma, of the French army, 73,000 men, not counting the guards who did nothing but loot during the entire war, there remained 36,000, though no more than 5,000 had been lost in battle. This is the first member of a progression which determines the subsequent members with mathematical certainty. The French army melted away and was annihilated in the same proportion from Moscow to Vyazma, from Vyazma to Smolensk, from Smolensk to Berezina, from Berezina to Vilno, irrespective of the greater or lesser degree of the cold, the pursuit, the barring of roads, and all other conditions taken separately. After Vyazma, the French army, instead of 3 columns, pressed together into a single mass, and so went on to the end. Berthier wrote to his sovereign, it is known how far superior officers allow themselves to depart from the truth in describing the situation of an army. He wrote, I believe it my duty to inform your majesty of the state of his troops in the different corps of the army that I have been able to observe over the past 2 or 3 days in different visits. They are on the point of disbanding. The number of soldiers following the colors is in the proportion of a quarter at most in almost all regiments. The rest march separately in different directions and on their own, in the hopes of finding subsistence and to be rid of discipline. In general, they consider Smolensk as the point where they must recuperate. In the last few days, many soldiers have been seen throwing down their cartridges and weapons. In this state of affairs, the interest of your Majesty's service, whatever his further plans, demands that we rally the army at Smolensk, beginning by ridding it of non-combatants, such as men without horses, and of useless baggage, and the artillery material, which is no longer in proportion to our present forces. Besides days of rest, subsistence is also necessary for the soldiers who are exhausted by hunger and fatigue. Many have died over the last days on the roads and in the bivouacs. This state of affairs keeps worsening and makes one fear that, if a prompt remedy is not applied, one will no longer be in control of the troops in the case of combat. 9th of November, 30 versts from Smolensk. Barging into Smolensk, which in their imagination was a promised land, the French killed each other over provisions, looted their own storehouses, and when everything had been looted, ran further. They all went, not knowing themselves where they were going or why. The genius Napoleon knew still less than the others, since no one gave him orders. But, even so, he and his entourage observed their long-standing habits, wrote orders, letters, reports, the ordres du jour, addressed each other as Sire, Mon Cousin, Prince Eckmühl, Roi de Naples, and so on. But the orders and reports existed only on paper, and nothing was carried out, according to them, because nothing could be carried out, and despite their calling themselves Majesties, Highnesses, and cousins, they all felt they were pathetic and vile people who had done a great deal of evil, for which they now had to pay. And despite their pretense of looking after the army, each of them thought only of himself and of how to get away quickly and save himself. Section 17. The action of the Russian and French armies during the reverse campaign from Moscow to the Niemen resemble a game of blind man's bluff, when two players are blindfolded and one occasionally rings a little bell to let the catcher know where he is. At first, the one to be caught rings without fearing the enemy, but when things go badly for him, he runs away from his enemy, trying to move inaudibly, and often, thinking to escape, goes straight into his arms. At first, Napoleon's troops let their presence be known, that this was in the initial period of their movement along the Kaluga road, but later, coming out to the Smolensk road, they began to run, holding the little bell's tongue, and often, thinking they were getting away, ran straight into the Russians. Owing to the quickness of the French flight and the Russian pursuit, and the resulting exhaustion of the horses, the chief means of roughly ascertaining the position of the enemy, cavalry patrols, did not exist. Besides that, as a result of the frequent and rapid change of position of the two armies, information, if there was any, could not arrive in time. If the news came on the second that the enemy had been in such and such place on the first, then on the third, when something could have been done, the army had already gone 2 marches further and was in a completely different position. One army ran, the other pursued. From Smolensk, the French had many different roads before them, and it would seem that, staying for 4 days, the French could have found out where the enemy was, worked out something advantageous, and undertaken something new. But after the 4-day halt, their crowds again ran, not to the right, not to the left, but without any maneuvers or considerations, down the old, worst road to Krasno and Orsha, by the beaten track. Expecting the enemy from behind, not from in front, the French ran, stringing out and separating from each other over a 24-hour stretch. Ahead of them all ran the emperor, then the kings, then the dukes. The Russian army, thinking that Napoleon would bear to the right, beyond the Dnieper, which was the only reasonable thing, also bored the right and came out on the main road to Krasno. And here, as in the game of blind man's bluff, the French ran into our vanguard. Unexpectedly sighting the foe, the French became confused, stopped from the unexpectedness of the fright, but then ran on again, abandoning their comrades who followed behind. Here, for 3 days, separate units of the French, first the viceroys, then Davout's, then Ney's, ran the gauntlet of the Russian troops. They all abandoned each other, abandoned their loads, artillery, half their men, and ran, getting around the Russians only by night, making semicircles to the right. Ney coming last because he had busied himself with blowing up the walls of Smolensk, which were not hindering anyone, in spite of their unfortunate position, or precisely because of it, they wanted to give a beating on the floor on which they had hurt themselves. Coming last, Ney, who had a corps of 10,000, came running to Napoleon in Orsha with only 1,000 men. And having abandoned all the other men and all his cannon and stolen away in the night, making his way through a forest and across the Dnieper. From Orsha they ran further along the road to Vilno, playing blind man's bluff with the enemy in the same way. At the Berezina, they again fell into confusion. Many were drowned, many surrounded, But those who got across the river ran further. Their supreme leader put on his fur coat and, getting into a sledge, galloped off alone, abandoning his comrades. Whoever could also rode off. Whoever could not surrendered or died. Section 18. It would seem, in this campaign of the flight of the French, that when they did everything they could to destroy themselves, when not a single movement of this crowd, from the turn onto the Kaluga road to the flight of the leader from his army, made the least sense. It would seem finally impossible, in this period of the campaign, for historians who ascribe the actions of the masses to the will of one man to describe this retreat in their sense. But no, mountains of books have been written by historians about this campaign, and they all describe Napoleon's orders and his profound plans, the maneuvers that guide the troops, and the brilliant orders of his marshals. The retreat from Maloyaroslavets, when the road to abundant lands was given to him, and when the parallel road to which Kutuzov later pursued him was also opened, the unnecessary retreat along a devastated road is explained to us by various profound considerations. His retreat from Smolensk to Orsha is described by means of the same profound considerations. Then his heroism at Krasno is described, where he is supposed to have been preparing to accept battle and command it himself, and walked about the birch with a birch stick, saying, Je sais assez faire l'empereur, il est temps de faire le général. And despite that, immediately following, ran further, abandoning to their fate the scattered units of the army he left behind. Then the greatness of soul of the marshals is described to us, especially of Ney, his greatness of soul consisting in his making a roundabout by way of night through the forest across the Dnieper, coming on the road to Orsha, minus banners and artillery and 9/10 of his troops. And lastly, the final departure of the great emperor from his heroic army is presented to us by historians as something great and marked by genius. Even this final act of flight, known in human language as the final degree of baseness, which every child is taught to be ashamed of, even this act receives justification in the language of the historians. Then, when it is no longer possible to stretch the so elastic threads of historical discourse any further, when an action clearly contradicts all that mankind calls good and just, historians resort to the saving notion of greatness. It is as if the greatness excludes the possibility of the measure of good or bad. For the great man, there is no bad. There is no horror that can be laid to the blame of someone who is great. C'est grand, said the historians. There is no longer any good or bad, but there is grand and not grand. Grand is good and not grand is bad. Grand, to their minds, is the property of some sort of special animals known as heroes, and Napoleon in his warm fur coat, clearing off for home from his perishing men who are not only comrades, but, in his opinion, people he has brought there, feels que c'est grand, and his soul is at peace. Du sublime, he sees something sublime in himself. Au ridicule il n'y a qu'un pas, he says. And for 50 years the whole world repeats, sublime, grand, Napoleon le Grand, du sublime au ridicule il n'y a qu'un pas. It is never anyone's head. It never enters anyone's head that the recognition of a greatness, not measurable by the measure of good and bad, is only a recognition of one's own insignificance and immeasurable littleness. For us, with the measures of good and bad given to us by Christ, nothing is immeasurable. There is no greatness where there is no simplicity, goodness, and truth. Section 19. Who, among Russian people reading the description of the last period of the campaign of 1812, has not experienced an oppressive feeling of vexation, dissatisfaction, and vagueness? Who has not asked himself the questions, why were all the French not captured, not destroyed when 3 armies surrounded them in superior numbers, when the disordered French, starving and freezing, surrendered in masses, and when, as the historians tell us, the aim of the Russians consisted precisely in cutting off, and capturing all the French? How did it happen that the Russian army, which, weaker in numbers than the French, gave battle at Borodino, how did it happen that this army, surrounding the French on 3 sides and having the aim of capturing them, failed to do so? Can it be that the French had such an enormous advantage over us, that we, surrounding them by superior forces, could not beat them? How could that happen? History, or what is called by that name, in answering these questions, says that this happened because Kutuzov and Tormasov and Chikagov and so and so and so and so did not execute such and such maneuvers. But why did they not execute all these maneuvers? Why, if they were to blame for not achieving the intended aim, why were they not tried and executed? But even if we allow that Kutuzov and Chikov and so on were to blame for the failure of the Russians, it is impossible to understand why, in such conditions as the Russians were in at Krasno and at Berzina, in both cases the Russians had superior forces, why was the French army, with its marshals, kings, and emperors, not taken captive, if that was the aim of the Russians? The explanation of this strange phenomena, as the Russian military historians give it, that Kutuzov prevented the attack, is groundless, because we know that Kutuzov could not keep the troops from attacking at Vyazma and at Torrentino. Why was the same Russian army with weaker forces? Why was the same Russian army, which with weaker forces could gain the victory at Borodino over an enemy in full force, defeated at Krasno and Berzina, where its forces were superior, by the disorderly crowds of the French? If the aim of the Russians consisted in cutting off and capturing Napoleon and the marshals, and that aim was not only not achieved, but all the attempts to achieve it were thwarted each time in the most shameful way, then the last period of the campaign is quite correctly presented by the French as a series of victories, and it is quite incorrectly presented by the Russian military historians as victorious. Russian military historians, insofar as they are bound by logic, involuntarily come to this conclusion, and despite lyrical proclamations of courage and devotion and so on, have had involuntarily to admit that the retreat of the French from Moscow was a series of victories for Napoleon and of defeats for Kutuzov. But, leaving national vanity completely aside, one feels that this conclusion contains an inner contradiction, because the series of French victories brought them to total destruction, while the series of Russian defeats led them to the total destruction of the foe and the purging of the fatherland. The source of this contradiction lies in the fact that historians who studied the events from the letters of sovereigns and generals, from relations, reports, plans, and so on, positive false, never existing aim for the last period of the War of 1812, an aim which supposedly consisted in cutting off and capturing Napoleon with his marshals and his army. This aim never existed and could not exist because it made no sense, and to achieve it was totally impossible. This aim made no sense, first, because Napoleon's disordered army was fleeing Russia with all possible speed, that is, carrying out the very thing that any Russian could desire. What, then, was the need of performing various operations on the French, who were simply fleeing as fast as they could? Second, it was senseless to stand in the way of people who had put all their energy into flight. Third, it was senseless to waste our troops on the destruction of the French army, which was being annihilated without any external causes, in such a progression that, without any blocking of the path, they were unable to bring across the border more than what they brought across in the month of December, that is 1/100th of the entire army. Fourth, it was senseless to wish to take any prisoner. The emperor, the kings, the dukes, the people who capture, would have hampered the action of the Russians in the highest degree, as was recognized by the most skillful diplomat of that time, Joseph de Maistre and others. Still more senseless would have been the wish to capture the whole corps of the French, when our own troops had melted away by half before reaching Krasno. And for corps of prisoners it would have been necessary to detach divisions as a convoy, and when our own soldiers did not always receive full rations, and the prisoners already taken were starving to death. The whole profound plan of cutting off and capturing Napoleon and his army was like the plan of a farmer who, while driving out the cattle who were trampling his vegetable garden, would run to the gate and start beating those cattle on the head. But the one thing that might be said to justify the farmer is that he was very angry. But it would be impossible to say even that about the devisers of this project, because it was not they who suffered from the trampled vegetable path. But besides the fact that cutting off Napoleon and his army was senseless, it was also impossible. It was impossible because, as is clear from experience, in battle, the movement of columns over a stretch of 3 miles never conforms to plans, so the probability of Chikov, Kutuzov, and Wittgenstein coming together on the time and the appointed place would have been so slight that it was next to impossible, as Kutuzov thought, who, on receiving plans, said that diversions over long distances did not bring about the desired results. Second, it was impossible because, in order to paralyze that force of inertia with which Napoleon's troops were moving back, an incomparably bigger army was needed than which the Russians had. Because the military term "to cut off" has no meaning. One can cut off a piece of bread, but not an army. To cut off an army, to bar its way, it is quite impossible, because there is always plenty of room for it to go around. And there is the night, during which nothing can be seen, of which military historians could satisfy themselves if only from the examples of Krasno and Berzina. To take a prisoner is quite impossible unless the one being taken prisoner agrees to it, just as it is impossible to catch a swallow, though you can catch one if it settles on your hand. It is possible to take prisoners someone who surrenders, like the Germans, according to the rules of strategy and tactics, but the French troops quite rightly did not find that suitable, since death from hunger and cold awaited them equally in flight and in captivity. Fourth, and chiefly, it was impossible because never, as long as the world has existed, has there been a war under such terrible conditions as those in which the War of 1812 took place. And the Russian troops strained with all their forces in their pursuit of the French and could not do more without destroying themselves. In its movement from Torotino to Krasno, the Russian army lost 50,000 men, fallen or sick or fallen behind, which is a number equal to the population of a large provincial town. Half the men dropped out of the army without any battles. And of this period of the campaign, when troops without boots and warm coats, without sufficient rations, without vodka, for months spent nights in the snow at 15 degrees of frost, when the day is only 7 or 8 hours long and the rest is night, during which discipline can have no influence. When, not as in battle in which men enter the realm of death, where there is no longer any discipline, but only for a few hours, but where men live for months, fighting every moment with death from hunger and cold, when half the army perishes within a month. Of this period of the campaign, we are told by historians how Miloradovich was to have made a flanking movement here, and Tormasov there, and how Chikagov was to have moved over there to move knee-deep in snow, and how so-and-so overran and cut off, and so on and so forth. The Russians, dying by half, did all they could do and could have done to achieve an aim worthy of the nation, and are not to blame if other Russian people sitting in warm rooms proposed doing what was impossible. This whole strange, now incomprehensible contradiction between the facts and the historical descriptions comes only from the fact that historians who wrote about this event wrote the history of the beautiful feelings and words of various generals and not the history of the events themselves. They find very interesting the words of Miloradovich, the decorations received by this or that general, and their own speculations. And the question of those 50,000 men left in hospitals and graves does not even interest them because it is not a subject to their study. And yet one need only turn from the study of reports and general plans and look into the movement of those hundreds of thousands of men who took a direct, immediate part in the event, and all the questions that previously seemed insoluble suddenly, and with extraordinary ease and simplicity, receive an unquestionable solution. The aim of cutting off Napoleon and his army never existed, except in the imaginations of several dozen people. It could not exist because it was senseless, and to achieve it was impossible. The aim of the people was one, to clear their land of the invasion. That aim was being achieved, first of all, by itself, since the French were running away, and therefore it only followed that this movement should not be stopped. Second, this aim was achieved by the actions of the national war in obliterating the French, and third, by the fact that a large Russian army was following the French, ready to use force in case the movement of the French stopped. The Russian army had to act like a whip on a running animal, and the experienced driver knew that it was most advantageous to hold the whip raised, to threaten, but not to lash the animal on the head. And there you have it. That is where we will stop today. We have reached the end of section 3 of volume 4. Very exciting! Yay! So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, all that's left is part 4 of volume 4. And and I think, oh, let's see, it might be longer than I thought. I thought we might be able to get to it by the end of the week, and that takes us basically to the end of the book. And then next week we can start the epilogue, because there is a multi-part epilogue. Sorry guys, I didn't realize how long it was. And a little I think there's a little author's note at the end. Yes, there's just the epilogue, which will tidy everything up for us. So we're doing bang up work as it is. And it's quite an interesting section. Definitely glad that Pierre is still alive, has made it out, and has finally been recaptured by Russian soldiers, um, which hopefully greatly increases his chance of being alive. Unfortunately, it is by Dolokhov and Denisov. Denisov, good man, um, and good friends to the Rostov, so they have that mutual friendship. Dolokhov is the one who Pierre dueled, so I feel like there might still be some bad blood there. Pierre shot him. He didn't die, but he, accused him of having an affair with his wife, and he shot him. So that could be a little bit of a sticky situation. But they do have the Denisov thing, and they have that common affection with the Rostovs, which unfortunately will be a little bit traumatic right now as young Petya has died, which is quite sad. He's like a boy. I think he's just turned 16. So I'm sorry, I'm not really speaking at the microphone, so that can't be helpful. He's just really just a boy. He's 16. He's a teenager. In America, he'd be getting his driver's license, not driving his horse into a crowd of shooting enemy forces, and falling off his horse and getting shot in the head. So it's kind of sad. He seemed like a sweet, albeit like fiery little boy. And Natasha will probably take it especially hard because they were very close. So that's a double trauma for her, having lost Prince Andre and now her favorite younger brother. And I'm sure the Countess will take it quite hard. But hopefully young Nikolai Rostov will be slightly more sensible, and we'll see him make it out alive. And I'd still like to see him and Princess Maria kind of maybe make a go of things. And hopefully something good will come for Sonia. But there's so much still to see, so many intrigues and dramas and people's stories to figure out. So stay tuned and we'll get some more in tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Hope you're having a great day. See you tomorrow.